My name's Kevin Martin. I'm coming to you from the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program, and I wanted to continue our discussion in this week's podcast about some labor management issues affecting New York. Last week we basically covered how that is impacting Pennsylvania, and so far we don't really see much of an impact on our bordering counties. So for the moment, this is just an issue for New York as we see low unemployment. Maybe we'll start to see spillover near the border, but we're not there yet. One of the other things that's going to hit New York farmers is our new overtime rules, and we've been sort of trickling out information as it becomes available, but we're pretty much finalized, at least for now. The way the regulations are set up, there is going to be the ability for those regulations to change based on decisions a board makes relatively soon after implementation of the law in January of 2020. So we won't actually know anything right away in terms of how it will be set forever, but we know what it's going to look like in January. And one of the concerns, of course, is just paying overtime. And some farmers have thought that maybe the best way around that would be to salary an employee. And any farmer is free to provide an employee with a salary and to sort of make it easier to pay the employee with potentially a little bit less paperwork. Whether they work 28 or 29 hours, you can pay them the same amount. It may be enticing to both the employer and the employee. To avoid overtime rules, though, the employee has to be exempt. So just because you pay them a salary doesn't mean you're avoiding overtime. You could have a salaried employee who is a non-exempt employee. There's a fairly complicated test to figure out if an employee is actually exempt. Not saying that private companies are not necessarily pretty aggressive with their interpretation of this test, but it does go to litigation, especially for large companies or if there's a wage complaint. So compliance is fairly important. Exempt employees have to be either executive, administrative, or professional in capacity, and there's a definition and a test for each of those different roles. We could get into that a little bit if we have some time, but what I really want to touch on is what's been a long-standing federal and state requirement, but it's been expanded in New York State recently. It was supposed to be expanded on the federal level, but it was never finalized and eventually repealed. So whether they're executive, administrative, or professional, there's a minimum salary requirement. And in New York in 2020, for most of upstate, that will be $937.50 per week. On December 31st, 2020, it'll be $885 before that. So basically what that means, at least I think, I'm not exactly sure where wage prices are going to go and exactly what all farmers pay, but that salary minimum test is going to prevent most growers from using a salary to avoid overtime pay. And keep in mind this overtime pay is for overtime pay over 60 hours per week, or because of that strange addition, instead of being 40 hours per week, which is standard in the rest of the workforce, it will also be for workers who work and consent to working, because you can't make them anymore, work more than 6 days in a row. So on that seventh day, whether it's their 65th hour or their 7th hour of work, if it's 7 days in a row, they'll be paid overtime. And overtime, of course, just like the rest of the world, the rest of the private sector, is time and a half. If you do start paying more than $885 or $937 per week, we could probably get into the test of what a professional is, what an administrative person is, or what an executive is. For the most part, it would probably have to be either a professional or an executive in terms of trying to pass the test. And in terms of executive, you're really going to need to have an employee who has authority over other employees. Meaning, if you're out on vacation, they're going to have the ability to fire one of your other employees. And if they don't meet that test, it's going to start to get a little tricky. That being said, I don't think the salary minimum test is going to be passed by most of our growers, so I don't want to get into that too much. I also want to remind you that sexual harassment training is due October 9th. So you should have had a policy in place last year. There are form policies online that the state has offered that Cornell has written specifically for agriculture if you want something a little more tailored to your business. And then the training for that as well. Both New York State and Cornell have provided some model training that passes the requirement. It's not something that an outside individual can just provide to you online or through a YouTube video, because there has to be at least some interaction and an ability for a grower or for an employee to ask a grower or owner or manager questions about the policy. Paid family leave is still a thing, and grape growers, farmers still remain exempt from it. As the adoption rate of that goes up, everybody else outside of farming and a few other industries are required to have paid family leave for their employees. I think it's just something to watch as we see rising labor costs, because if there is an expectation that paid family leave is provided, if the employees demand it, there is some paperwork to it, but there's not really a whole lot of cost to it. So it is something you could consider, depending on the nature of your employees and how many employees you have. It may be worthwhile to you. Other than that, there are some other changes that I think we'll touch on in another podcast. But the overtime rules and the salary test that goes along with it, the paid family leave, and the sexual harassment policies are sort of the big things that are hitting right now. Like I said, last week we touched on minimum wage, and that covers a lot of the big changes. But this is something you need to stay on top of if you have employees, and we all know most growers have quite a few employees, especially during the pruning season and harvest season. So hopefully you catch this either during or after harvest and think about how you can change your practices to cope with these regulations. If you have any questions, please contact our offices or comment down below. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks a lot for joining us.